This is Guns and Butter.
Something happening here. Yeah. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there. Yeah, that's right.
I'm Bonnie Faulkner. Today on Guns and Butter, Dr. Michael Hudson. Today's show, Debt Deflation in Europe and America. Dr. Hudson is a financial economist and historian. He is president of the Institute for the Study of Long-Term Economic Trend, a Wall Street financial analyst, and distinguished research professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. His 1972 book, Super Imperialism, The Economic Strategy of American Empire, is a critique of how the United States exploited foreign economies through the IMF and World Bank. Today we discuss the crisis of the economy in Europe and the United States, creditors versus debtors, debt deflation, and the coming lost decade. Michael Hudson, welcome.
Thank you very much, Bonnie.
Michael, you are presently in Germany. Let's talk about Germany. Angela Merkel is due to attend a September 7th EU meeting that is very important. What is going to be discussed at the September 7th meeting?
This is a meeting of the Bundestag to discuss what the German courts are ruling as to whether the European Central Bank and now the German government can bail out Greece and Portugal and directly buy the bonds of these countries, or whether the Constitution prevents this. There is a European Union meeting over what's become a constitutional crisis here. The important thing is the issue that's come up in the EU Directorate over whether the European Central Bank should buy government debt or not. It's constitutionally blocked from buying government debt on the theory that this would run the danger of inflationary policies. And unlike the United States and England, where the central banks were founded to monetize the government debt so that they wouldn't have to pay interest. In Europe, the idea is that a central bank is independent from the government and is supposed to prevent the possibility of inflation, and it can't buy government debt. Now, Angela Merkel is saying, well, we want to buy the debts of Greece and Portugal and other countries in trouble because otherwise they're going to default and can't pay the banks. And what we have to do is not really bail out Greece and Portugal. We have to bail out the French and the German banks that are holding their government bonds. Otherwise, the yields will go up on these bonds, and the banks will lose money. And we'd much rather push our country into poverty and make the people lose by paying the banks because that's what the banks tell us, that without their making super profits, the economy is not going to recover because they'll wreck the economy if we don't do what they say. It's like America. They're saying, we have the power to stop the payment system, and we're holding you hostage, and we will wreck the economy if you don't take our losses onto the public balance sheet. If you don't do what they did in Ireland and bail out the banks and make the taxpayers make sure that the banks don't make money, then you can say goodbye to the economy because the economy rests on the financial core. We, in the financial centers, are the economy. So needless to say, there's a big political split in Angela Merkel's own party over whether Germany should go along and help buy the debts of countries that are running fiscal deficits and support them. At issue is what is the responsibility of a government and of the EU for its parts. Now, what I found out over here, as I've talked to the people, is the whole morality of finance and economics is very different here from the United States. So if your listeners are trying to follow the news in Europe, they should learn what I've been learning over here. In the United States, states can go under, like Alabama or Birmingham, and the federal government says, well, that's your problem. We don't have any liability. I understand that yesterday the Republicans in Congress said that, well, regarding the victims of the hurricane on the East Coast, you cannot spend any money to bail them out unless you cut government spending somewhere else, preferably in Social Security. And this is unthinkable in Europe. For instance, it was explained to me that the German government always supports or bails out Berlin, which runs at a deficit. So there's a feeling that every national government has to support the states and the cities as part of their mutual aid ethic that goes way back. Now, the question before Europe is, should this principle of a government supporting the region, Italy, for instance, for 50 years has supported the South, the Mezzogiorno, the poor region. Should Europe take responsibility for the rich nations supporting other countries that are in the position of the Mezzogiorno in Italy or Berlin, or should they be treated as completely separate? So the whole character of Europe is being determined right now, and it's being determined on the conditions that are going to affect the financial markets, whether these governments can issue debt, what's going to happen to the banks that have the bonds. And there's a difference in banking, too, that shapes all of this. In the United States, for instance, the Federal Reserve can create as much money it wants to fund the U.S. government spending. That's not the case over here. Instead of no continental European central bank actually monetizes its own deficit spending. It relies on the financial markets to do this, and financial institutions, banks, insurance companies are required under the law to hold a specific portion of their reserves in the form of government bonds. So there's a linkage between the banking system and finance and major institutions with the financing of government debt instead of the government central bank doing it. So there's a whole difference in economic structure between Europe and the United States that makes the same words mean something completely different over here.
Now, there's going to be an EU meeting.
Yeah.
Now, what is going to be discussed at this meeting?
The constitutional issue of whether the European Central Bank should buy government debt, should buy bonds of Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and other governments that all of a sudden are seen to have big fiscal deficits.
Now, who would be buying these bonds?
There is a European Central Bank that essentially is autonomous and is European-wide. In other words, the European Union, the countries that are members, are all part of the European Central Bank.
Now, is this central bank part of the government, or is this private?
It's all government. The Europeans can't imagine a private central bank. So it is a government body, but it's independent of the government. In other words, it's run by bank officials, not by elected officials, not by Parliament, although its heads are appointed by Parliament. So the situation there is very much like the Federal Reserve here. What kind of people are going to get appointed either to the U.S. Federal Reserve or to a central bank in Europe? It's people with financial experience working for the big banks in Wall Street in America. If you're with the Federal Reserve, you're basically appointed from Goldman Sachs, and you act as a lobbyist to support the bank's interest in the economy against the rest of the people. So if the Federal Reserve of New York, when Tim Geithner was running it, was basically, how can we bail out the big banks in Wall Street and transfer the loss onto taxpayers? In Europe, the situation isn't quite that drastic because the financial situation isn't that drastic. But obviously the kind of people who are appointed to any central bank are monetary people who have the worldview of the financial sector. And the banking worldview is something that no matter what, the banks have to stay solvent. Well, the banks now, if they're buying a bond of Greece or somewhere else, all of a sudden they have to pay huge risk insurance premiums in order to protect themselves against the fact that Greece may simply say, look, we don't have enough money to pay the bonds. And this brings up the other moral issue that's being talked about here. To what extent should a country impose austerity and even depression on itself, more than a Great Recession, an entire lost decade on itself, simply to pay interest to bondholders who've been financing a fiscal system that hasn't really taxed the rich in Greece? The countries that are in trouble were all fascist at one point. Spain under Franco, Portugal, Greece under the colonels. All of these countries were wrecked for a generation by very right-wing military dictatorships that put in place a tax system that didn't really tax the rich at all. You could say it's the Republican Party's dream and the Obama administration's dream, taxing labor, not the rich. It's the direction in which the whole world seems to be going these days. But the result is that these are the countries that are in trouble.
Well, what does the Lisbon Treaty prescribe? What does this treaty say?
There are a number of very bad things that it says. For one thing, it said that member countries in the Eurozone, that is the countries using the euro, should keep their budget deficits within 3% of GDP. Now, this means that they are unable, under the agreement, they're unable to run a counter-cyclical Keynesian-type policy. Now that there's a recession throughout Europe and as there is in America, what governments should be doing is indeed running a deficit to help restore employment and to restore markets. But they're not able to run it there. And because of the deficits they've been running up in past years, more and more of the budget of Greece, Portugal, Spain, Ireland, all has to be paid for interest, and the interest payments and the subsidies to the wealthy are crowding out social payments, social spending as a whole. So the result is an economic polarization between creditors and debtors.
Now, are there any laws in Europe to restrict the European Central Bank from how much debt it buys?
Yeah, it's not allowed to buy any government debt.
Then why are they discussing this?
Because Angela Merkel says, look, if you don't buy government debt, and if you don't lend money to these countries, they're going to default on their bonds. And if they default on the bonds, then the banks are going to go under and there will be a crisis.
So this is why you're calling this meeting a constitutional crisis?
I'm not calling it that. That's what they're talking about here.
Okay, well then, what you're saying then is that Angela Merkel is proposing a constitutional change in Europe.
It's very hard to change the Constitution. They're just proposing that the European Central Bank ignore the Constitution. And that's why members of her own parties have been coming right out and saying, wait a minute, we can't do this. It's not constitutional. So she has a fight within her own party as to what to do.
Right. And does she also have a fight with the other heads of the other European states?
The same fight is going on in almost every country. Should the European Central Bank do this or not?
Now, has the Central European Bank ever done this in the past?
No.
So this would be a break with the past?
Yes, break with the past.
Okay.
For instance, Christian Wolff is Germany's president. Last week, he said the European Central Bank is going far beyond its mandate by purchasing Spanish and Italian debt. And he said that this rush towards a fiscal union is striking at the very core of democracy. What he's saying is, wait a minute, if you're going to go against the constitutions, decisions have to be made in Parliament in a liberal democracy. That's what legitimacy is. So the question is, who's making the policy? Is it the Constitution? Is it the government? Who is making this policy of buying debt?
Exactly.
September 7th is the day that this whole package goes to the Bundestag. So maybe I wasn't clear on that at the beginning. It's September 7th that the Constitutional Court in Germany is going to rule on the legality of the whole European Union's bailout policy. Now, people are wondering is how is the court going to rule? And that's why the market is going down. That's why the euro is under such pressure going down. Because if the Constitutional Court rules that there's a 440 billion euro, that's about $600 billion, if the rescue fund breaches the treaty law, or if it undermines German fiscal sovereignty, then there's going to be a whole fire over, gee, do we want a monetary union or not? And if they don't want a monetary union, then what does that mean for the EU? The problem is that the EU